Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, discussing why it's so difficult for the public to get to the truth about any important issue. An excellent example of this is what's going on in Texas right now. For at least the past 25 years, Texas academics have been predicting that Texas is just going to get hotter and drier. These forecasts from academics have had a major impact on Texas energy policy. 1 month ago, Greens were bragging that almost all new power plants built this year will be wind or solar. 3 weeks ago, our leading atmospheric experts using their computer models predicted that Texas was going to have a very warm February. And less than 1 week ago, Greens and the press were bragging that wind energy had a banner year in 2020, producing as much as 60% of Texas electricity needs. They said that Texas proved the Green New Deal would work. But a couple of days later, nearly half of the wind turbines in Texas froze, leaving millions of people without electricity. The Green New Deal in Texas had failed rather badly. Alexandria Cortez weighed in her usual Orwellian fashion and said, "The infrastructure failures in Texas are quite literally what happens when you don't pursue a Green New Deal." And Texas Greens weighed in as well, saying, "We really don't use much wind power in Texas." They said Texas is a gas state and the problems were due to the fact that they couldn't get enough fossil fuels to people quickly enough. So the same people who were bragging 1 week ago about how well wind power was doing in Texas suddenly changed their story to say that Texas doesn't use much wind and that the state relies on fossil fuels which they couldn't get enough of quickly enough. Essentially, they admitted that huge amounts of fossil fuels are needed to keep Texas running and that wind power simply isn't getting the job done. Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw explained the problem very succinctly in this Facebook post. A mix of over-subsidized wind energy and underinvestment in gas power means that we didn't have enough baseload energy for a massive spike in demand. The bottom line is that they listened to the climate scientists and made all the wrong policy decisions as a result. Bill Gates then weighed in and said the Texas government was wrong. The wind turbines could have kept running had they been designed properly. He said that in northern climates the turbine blades are heated, which keeps them from icing up. So over the past week, Greens have told us that Texas uses a lot of wind, Texas uses very little wind, and that the problem with the wind turbines is that they just weren't designed properly. So let's look at how they handle wind turbines in a colder climate like Scotland. During the very cold winter of 2010 in Britain, there was very little wind and wind farms produced practically no electricity. On January 11, 2010, it was reported that the cold weather has been accompanied by high pressure and a lack of wind, which meant that only 0.2% of a possible 5% of the UK's energy was generated by wind turbines over the last few days. And to make matters worse, a lot of electricity was being consumed by the wind farms to power electric heaters inside the turbine blades. This made the wind farms net consumers of electricity rather than producers. And remember, this is Bill Gates' solution for keeping the turbines from icing up. The bottom line is that the wind doesn't blow very much during Arctic cold snaps. As is normally the case, Bill Gates has no clue what he's talking about. 2010 was a very bad year for wind power in the UK because it was very cold and the wind wasn't blowing very much. The only thing which kept Scotland going during this cold spell in 2010 was importing French nuclear power. You would think that the UK government would have learned something from this, given that 20% of their electricity comes from nuclear, but they are planning on retiring almost half of their nuclear capacity over the next 5 years. I've been writing about the problems of wind farms not working during cold weather for a long time. This is an article I wrote in 2009. On the coldest days there is no wind, so wind power fails just when you need it the most. And wind power also fails during the heat of the summer for the same reason. You get high pressure settling in and the wind stops blowing. Let's go back to Dan Crenshaw's post again and look at another major problem. To make matters worse, existing storage of wind energy in batteries was almost gone because batteries are losing 60% of their energy in the cold. Everybody knows that green energy is not reliable, so the green energy story depends very heavily on batteries. But the batteries fail when it's cold, just when you need them the most. Green energy is pretty much of a farce, as are the journalists and climate scientists who are pushing it. This article was published in the New York Times this week, saying that we don't get as much cold weather as we used to because of global warming, but when we do get cold weather now, it's also because of global warming. So global warming causes less cold weather, and it also causes more cold weather. This is how climate scientists explain it. There's evidence that climate change can weaken the polar vortex, which allows more chances for frigid air to ooze into the lower 48, said University of Georgia meteorology professor Marshall Shepard. So climate scientists are saying that the polar vortex is caused by Arctic warming and melting Arctic sea ice. Let's see if that makes sense. This is today's weather anomalies for the entire planet. The northern hemisphere is exactly normal, and the southern hemisphere is a little bit below normal. The climate scientists say the globe is much warmer than it used to be. Perhaps they should look at a current weather map. This is from today's New York Times. This doesn't look too much like overheating to me. Now let's compare today's map to the temperature anomaly map from the U.S. Weather Bureau from February 1936. Note that the weather map from February 1936 is almost exactly the same. In other words, the climate hasn't changed at all. And as far as Arctic sea ice goes, extent is the highest it's been in the last 6 years and right on the edge of the normal range. Nothing that these climate scientists are saying has anything to do with reality. Now let's go back 45 years during the Ice Age scare. Climate scientists blamed the identical weather patterns and extreme weather on global cooling and expanding Arctic ice, the exact opposite of what they're saying now. Time magazine, Another Ice Age, Monday, June 24, 1974. Scientists have found other indications of global cooling. For one thing, there's been a noticeable expansion of the Great Belt of dry, high-altitude polar winds, the so-called circumpolar vortex. And they blame drought, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and every other form of bad weather on global cooling, the same things they now blame on global warming. During the winter of 1977, it snowed in Miami. That's the only time that's ever happened. And in the December 1977 issue of National Geographic, they showed how the polar vortex caused the cold weather in the eastern half of the United States. In this slide, the diagram on top is the current explanation from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for what's causing the cold weather. They say that global warming is causing waves in the jet stream. But the bottom diagram is from Science News, March 1975, and it's almost identical to the top diagram. The difference is that in 1975, climate scientists blamed the identical pattern on global cooling rather than global warming like they do now. The point I'm making is that climate science is not a real science. These are just a bunch of ambulance chasers and snake oil salesmen. They don't know what they're talking about. They're simply making up ad hoc explanations as they go along. Now let's get down to what the root of the problem actually is. A very small handful of rich people, like Bill Gates, have control over the media. They don't allow debate, and they don't allow any other story to be heard. I gave a very detailed presentation to the Washington State Senate 4 years ago. It consisted almost entirely of weather and climate reporting from the New York Times over the past 100 years. Just like in this video, I showed how the story has changed over and over again over the past 100 years. All of my sources in the presentation were trusted sources for Democrats, so they really didn't have any good argument to use against me. If we had a real press corps, they would have reported on what I said, but this is how it was reported by the Seattle Press. I showed them over 100 years of climate change, and this is how the Seattle Weekly reported it. Climate change denier testifies for 40 minutes before state senate. But I didn't deny climate change. I showed them that the climate is always changing. No one in the press will allow an honest discussion about climate because the very wealthy people who are paying their bills won't permit it. And as a result of decades of misinformation and propaganda, the poor and middle class are paying a very high price. Joe Biden's promise to implement the Green New Deal has caused energy prices to skyrocket since the election. This is the single most regressive tax on the poor, who are now forced to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. But it's not just the poor who are getting hurt. It now costs $900 to recharge your Tesla in Texas. Texas is frozen and the windmills aren't working, so the solution which climate alarmists have come up with is we need to stop global warming by building more windmills. And it's not just the windmills which aren't working, the solar panels aren't working either because they're covered with ice. I took this picture in northern Colorado a few days ago of the Rawhide coal-powered electrical generating station. This very small power plant supplies almost all of the electricity to northern Colorado, and it's extremely clean, as you can see. It's just putting out a little bit of steam. But the governor of Colorado listens to the scientists, and he's shutting down this coal-fired power plant and replacing with miles and miles of solar panels. These solar panels have destroyed huge amounts of prairie and wildlife habitat, and they're covered with snow. When I took these pictures, the temperature was 10 below 0 Fahrenheit or minus 24 Celsius. The solar panels were covered with snow, there was no wind, and green energy was completely useless. People in northern Colorado were completely dependent on the coal plant for their survival. Yet which one is the governor shutting down? He's shutting down the reliable coal plant and not the useless solar panels. This is what happens when billionaires like Bill Gates control the news media and refuse to allow the public to hear accurate information. Very bad policy decisions get made. In New York right now, wind and solar are providing 0.41% of their electricity needs, and New Yorkers are paying 70% higher electricity prices for that. In states all over the country, government policy makes no sense. Lawmakers have been intentionally misinformed by the news media. The National Center for Atmospheric Research is located in Boulder, Colorado, but they built their supercomputing center up here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and this is where they run their climate models, which require a huge amount of electricity. So why did they decide to build their supercomputing center in Wyoming, which is 100 miles away? Well, the answer is very simple. Wyoming is the #1 producer of coal in the country, and electricity is much cheaper here than in Colorado, where they have lots of green energy taxes. Climate scientists caused the high energy prices in Colorado, but they don't want to pay the price for what they've done. Bill Gates is largely responsible for the climate misinformation, which is causing problems in frozen states all over the country. And he wants to make the situation even worse. People are freezing in the dark right now, and he wants to pollute the atmosphere to reduce sunshine even more. This will make it even colder, it will make it more difficult for people to keep warm, and it will make solar energy even less efficient than it is now. And therein lies the root of the problem. A few very rich people are keeping the public from hearing accurate information. They don't allow debate, they don't allow dissent, and they don't allow good science to be heard. We don't have a real press corps anywhere in the Western world. This is how Glenn Greenwald describes it. Thus do we have the unimaginably warped dynamic in which U.S. journalists are not the defenders of free speech values, but the primary crusaders to destroy them. They do it in part for power, to ensure nobody but they can control the flow of information. They do it partly for ideology and out of hubris, the belief that their worldview is so indisputably right that all dissent is inherently dangerous disinformation. And they do it from petty vindictiveness. They clearly get aroused, find otherwise elusive purpose by destroying people's reputations and lives, no matter how powerless. Whatever the motive, corporate media employees whose company's title is journalist are the primary activists against a free and open internet and the core values of free thought. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.